Here's our first digital lecture for human body systems this year. This presentation is about tissues. If we're going to talk about tissues, we have to first kind of discuss the overall organization in the body. So of course cells are the basic unit of organization. This is the smallest individual piece of you that's distinguishable. Cells can be grouped together into tissues. It's like a cluster of cells that are locally in the same spot, and they perform the same function. All those cells in that tissue do the same thing. Tissues can be grouped together into organs, so you've got different groups of tissue types that are organized and work together, and then organ systems are just multiple different organs that all play some role in performing specific functions, and they kind of work together to do that. Now it's important to remember that some organs may be members of several different body systems, which we will find out quite a bit about this as we go through our human body systems class this year. So there are four main groups of tissues. The first that we're going to talk about is called epithelial tissue. Epithelial kind of means lining. So the places on the body where you find different types of epithelial tissue are like the inner and outer surfaces of organs. So you can think of like your bladder is a pouch and it has an outside surface and an inside surface, and there would be epithelial tissue lining both of those surfaces, inside and outside. Inside of your mucous membranes, so like your mouth and nose, that's full of epithelial tissue, and then also on the surface of your skin. So this is just a microscope slide that shows some epithelial tissue. The epithelial tissue is this stuff towards the outside of whatever chunk of tissue this is in general. The epithelial tissue is this stuff on the outside. Epithelial tissue comes in several different flavors, and the form that it takes is highly dependent on what the job of that epithelial tissue is. So squamous shaped epithelial tissue are these kind of flat little squish ones. You can have a simple squamous, which is just a single layer of the squamous epithelium, or you can have stratified. Stratified means layers. And so stratified squamous is just a bunch of different layers of this epithelial tissue stacked on top of each other. So typically the function of this kind of stuff is going to be like allowing for diffusion of nutrients across the membranes. Cuboidal shaped epithelium, cuboidal is a nice name for it because they're pretty cube shaped. Again, you can have simple, just a single layer, or you can have stratified, which is multiple layers of these. A lot of times these cuboidal shaped epithelial tissue cells are going to play more of a role with like the secretion of substances. So like these are the kind of things that you would find in your sweat glands. And then the columnar shapes, again, a nice name for this because they're kind of column shaped. They're taller than they are wide. So you can have the simple, just a single layer of these, stratified, so multiple layers, or you can have the ones that are called pseudo-stratified. Pseudo in science means like false, so these are falsely stratified. They kind of look like they're in layers, but it's just because the shapes are kind of wonky. And a lot of times these columnar shaped ones are going to be focusing more on the absorption of nutrients in the body. Next type of tissue is muscle tissue. There's three main types of muscle tissue. They are skeletal muscle, which is any muscle tissue that is attached to your bones and allows you to move your skeleton around. There's cardiovascular muscle tissue, which is the type of muscle that makes up the heart. And then there is smooth muscle tissue, which makes up pretty much the rest of your organs and like your blood vessels and stuff like that. So let's just quickly talk about these different types of muscle a little bit more in depth. Here is a picture showing what skeletal muscle looks like under a microscope. Skeletal muscle is striated, and striated means it kind of has a stripy appearance. So if you look at this, you can see there's kind of these bands here. That's the striations of the skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle cells are also multinucleated, which means that they have more than one nucleus in each cell. So these dark spots here are the nuclei of these skeletal muscle cells. And then skeletal muscle is also voluntary. So that means that there are nerves running to skeletal muscle that are connected to your brain in a way that you can create the movement of the skeletal muscle. That's like the whole point of the skeletal muscle, is that we can move our bones around so that we can get where we need to go. Not all of the types of muscle have this voluntary control aspect. Next is cardiovascular muscle, so the type of muscle that makes up the heart. Cardiovascular muscle is also striated, so it has that kind of stripy appearance under a microscope. Typically, these are only going to have one nucleus per cell, so that's an easy way that you can tell skeletal muscle apart from cardiovascular muscle if you're looking at a slide. Cardiovascular muscle is involuntary, which is good because it would really be difficult if we had to think about our heart beating every single time it needed to beat. So cardiovascular muscle contracts all on its own. And cardiovascular muscle also has this feature called intercalated discs, and that is like the telltale sign that you're looking at cardiovascular muscle. It's because in between each of the cells there's this little junction, this little dark line that shows up. This is kind of like an adhesion between the adjoining cells to make sure that they can all contract at exactly the same time, the way the heart needs to. So these intercalated discs are a very good way to tell that you're looking at cardiovascular muscle under a microscope. So the last type of muscle is called smooth muscle. It's called smooth because it's non-striated. It doesn't have that stripy banded appearance that both the skeletal muscle and cardiovascular muscle have when you look at them under a microscope. Smooth muscle is also involuntary like the cardiac muscle. You don't have to think about your smooth muscle moving. It does it all by itself. And this is important because smooth muscle is involved in this movement in the body called peristalsis. This is like the involuntary contraction of a bunch of your different organs. So like peristalsis is the way that food moves through your digestive tract. Peristalsis is the way that urine moves through your bladder and your urethra. Peristalsis is this involuntary action that is characteristic of smooth muscle. The third type of tissue is called connective tissue. Connective tissue functions as connection, support, or binding organs or tissues together, or sometimes connective tissue can even be in the body separating different types of tissues that shouldn't quite be touching each other. The most important defining characteristics of connective tissue is that it has some type of extracellular matrix made out of fibers. Typically, these fibers are made out of some kind of protein. Quite often, it's going to be collagen in the body. But here is just a microscope slide showing some hyaline cartilage. This is like what you find in your joints. And you can see kind of all this webby, stringy stuff out here. That is that extracellular matrix of fibers that distinguishes connective tissue. So let's just quickly discuss a few of the most common types of connective tissue in the body. First, we have cartilage. Cartilage is a rubber-like padding that's found in between the joints of your skeleton to keep the bones from rubbing together. It protects the ends of the long bones, so like your femur connecting to your hip. There's a good amount of cartilage in there so that those bones don't rub against each other. But then cartilage can also be the actual structural component of some parts of the body. So like in the rib cage, many of the ribs are connected to the sternum by cartilage alone. Your ear and your nose are made of essentially cartilage, which is obviously it's softer than bone tissue, but it's also still quite strong. And then the intervertebral discs, those are the discs of cartilage in between the vertebra of your spine to keep your little spine bones from crunching against each other every time you move. Bone is another type of connective tissue, which is kind of interesting to think about, but it's because it has an extremely strong extracellular matrix made of this protein called collagen. A lot of people think of bones as being just kind of this not really almost like a rock, like it's just kind of there. It's either hard or it's not, something like that. But bones are constantly being remodeled. They're constantly breaking down in some places and being built stronger in other places. And so they're made of this protein called collagen. Collagen is an animal protein, and you have got to get collagen in your diet because really most of your body is made out of collagen. So you can see in this picture this really dense matrix, crisscross matrix of collagen inside of a bone. Blood is also interestingly considered a connective tissue. The extracellular matrix of blood is considered to be the plasma. So of course we know that blood is several different types of cells that are all suspended in the liquid portion of the blood, which is called plasma, and that is considered the matrix. So we call it a connective tissue because it kind of like connects everything in the body. It transports all the nutrients throughout the body. So it's like connecting every piece of your body to the other by the blood flow. Now, Adipose tissue is actually also considered a connective tissue. Adipose tissue is also known as fat. This is what it looks like under a microscope slide. Each of the cells, you can see the outline of the cells. They look kind of like bubbles, and then the body fat is stored within those. Now, adipose doesn't necessarily have a real strong matrix made out of protein, but this kind of webbiness in between each of the cells is considered to be the matrix, and so that's why we call adipose a connective tissue. Okay, finally we have nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is what makes up your brain and spinal cord, as well as all of the different nerves that run throughout your body. Nervous tissue is made of a type of cell called neurons, which function to carry electrical impulses throughout the body. That is how your brain communicates with the rest of your body and tells it what it needs to be doing, is through electrical impulses that travel through the individual neurons of the nervous tissue. So an important thing about nervous tissue is that neurons all have these two features on them. Dendrites are like these little branches that stick off of the main cell body that receive impulses from another neuron. And then there's a really long arm coming off of each neuron that's called an axon, and this is where this individual neuron will then send its electrical impulse to send it to another cell. And so covering this axon is this stuff called the myelin sheath, which we'll talk about quite a bit later on. But myelin is basically just this fatty type of substance that covers the axon, and it functions to make electrical impulses travel really fast down the axon, and so that's how there's not really very much lag time in between when your brain decides to perform an action and when you perform the action. It's because of this myelin sheath.